Welcome to the Leading with Instinct podcast, where we dive deep into leadership, personal growth, and how the intuitive nature of horse herd dynamics can give you the tools you need to lead with confidence and clarity. I'm Ginny Telego.
And I'm Katie Navarra-Bradley.
In today's episode, Katie and I talk about the challenges and opportunities of leading and being part of multi-generational teams, and how horses can teach us to let go of assumptions and leverage differences to enhance performance.
This is the Leading with Instinct podcast, focusing on intuitive leadership and fostering deep team connections through equine experiential leadership development and coaching. Brought to you by KatieTheCoach.com and the Collaboration Partners. Now, here's your hosts, Katie Navarra-Bradley and Ginny Telego.
Hi, Katie. It's good to see you. Hey, can you believe we're already doing episode 5 of our podcast? It seems like it just wasn't that long ago that we were sitting at the Bob Evans in Worcester, Ohio, talking about doing this together.
Hi, Ginny. It's great to see you too. And no, I cannot believe it's episode 5, although I can tell you from my editorial and content creation background, we're always looking a year ahead. So we're already talking about 2026, which always makes me feel like we are rushing our life away. But I'm excited that we are now at episode 5 and are on a good roll.
Yeah, for sure. And so, as everyone knows, Katie and I are always brainstorming and, what can we talk about and what's relevant for our listeners. And so for this episode, we decided to have a conversation about the ongoing challenges leading and managing multi-generational teams. We know that leading and being part of cross-generational teams in the workplace can be highly enriching, and it also presents some unique challenges due to differences in values, communication styles, work expectations, all kinds of things. And I know in my leadership and team development workshops, and Katie, I'm sure you see this as well, and when I'm coaching leaders, the challenges of leading and being part of cross-generational teams is an ongoing discussion. Despite the fact that millennials have now been in the workforce for over 20 years. That was crazy to me when I was researching, pulling material for this, and I was like, wow, that's true, because I know a lot of millennials. I have nieces and nephews and other young people that I have known for quite a while. And I'm thinking, yeah, they're starting to get into their 40s. And they're still labeled negatively by Gen X and baby boomers. So even though they're contributing in all kinds of ways to the world. And Gen Z's oldest members are in their early 30s, right? I remember when there was all the talk about, Gen Z and what they were going to be like. And now here they are, they're in their early 30s. And they've been in the workforce now for, probably at least 10 years. And so there was a 2025 report that came out from Deloitte that surveyed millennials and Gen Z employees. And one of the things that I really was struck by in that, just the first part of that report, was these two generations are going to make up, get this, 74% of the global workforce by 2030. That's only 5 years from now. So in 5 years, 74% of the global workforce are going to be millennials and Gen Z. We got to get our stuff together here, Katie. And by that time, Gen Alpha, which is the group that follows Gen Z, will be coming into the workforce. So I think now is the opportunity for leaders to learn how to successfully manage these cross-generational teams and leverage the diverse perspectives they bring. So what about you, Katie? What about this topic was interesting to you, and what kind of great data have you found out? Because you're my data person.
Absolutely. First, I just have to say thanks for giving me the reality check on how long I've been in the workforce now.
Listen, join the club.
I remember being that 20-year-old millennial when they were all talking about us as millennials trying to join the workforce. But you're correct. This is a topic that I'm seeing crop up in a lot of places. One of our regional chambers just had a huge panel discussion about this. It's showing up a lot in research, and experts are writing about it. And not only do I find it fascinating that millennials and Gen Z are going to make up 70% of the workforce, but right now we have 5 different generations working in the workforce together today. That to me is mind-blowing. So what does that mean? That means we have traditionalists who were born in that 1928 to 1945 time frame. Yes, many of them, I shouldn't say many, some of them are still choosing to work because they love what they do, and they are acting in mentor roles in a lot of cases to help bring some of the younger generations up to speed. So we have the traditionalists, we have baby boomers who are also getting ready to retire at high rates. We have your Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z all working together. That's a lot of different generations. I think you mentioned that we've always had multiple generations working together, but this is really the first time in history that we've had such a span of age groups working together. And about 5 years ago, AARP surveyed global executives, and 83% of global business leaders recognize that multi-generational workforces are the key to growth and long-term success in their companies. Yet only 50% of global leaders consider it when they think about diversity. And over 95% of them don't do anything to embrace a multi-generational team. And part of it, we're going to get into today, but, I'd love to hear your thoughts, Ginny, on what makes it so challenging for us to change that mindset.
Well, I think that's just a really interesting conversation. And these data points that we're talking about are really important, especially for leaders. But it's important for leaders in organizations and communities, right? Because as millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha coming in are having families, and they're engaging in schools and in communities along with the workplace, it is shifting some of the dynamics happening. And one of the things that I think is part of the challenge for this is we don't like change. And there are some generations that are more resistant to change than others are. And so, I definitely think that the introduction of technology really significantly changed how generations experience the world, because there's very different experiences that millennials and Gen Z and now Gen Alpha, have in comparison to me, as I'm Gen Xer. I'm a very proud Gen Xer. And, there also was a desire for my generation made a choice to parent differently than we all had been parented. Not me, because I don't have kids, but I have lots of friends who have kids. And this is the big conversation that's been taking place for a long time, right? Is, Gen Xers were raised by baby boomers. We all grew up a certain way, and you can go on TikTok and hear all about it if, you want to learn more. But Gen X parents then decided that they were going to raise their kids, you guys, the millennials, in some different ways than the baby boomers had. And that, I think, had an impact, right? I've seen it. I think we've all seen it. And it's not negative. I think it just is. This is just what has happened. I also like to remind the baby boomer and Gen X folks that millennials and Gen Z didn't invent the technology that everybody complains about millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha being addicted to. And so, when we look at things through a different lens, sometimes I think that can really help. But, I think when we're looking at working in leading cross-generational teams, the challenges oftentimes are just simply because we don't want to have an understanding of the different experiences that everyone has had. Baby boomers grew up in a certain environment in the world. Gen X grew up in a certain environment in the world. You guys as millennials grew up in a certain environment. Gen X, Gen Alpha, everybody has experienced very different things happening in the world. And those things all impact us. They impact our belief systems. They impact how we approach things. And so, we have to create ways to have conversations. And I think that's one of the things that we want to talk about today is how to do that. Because I also know as Gen Z are becoming more engaged in the workforce, fascinating to hear how millennials talk about the challenges of working with and managing Gen Z. So This is an ongoing thing. I think it's always been taking place. But I do think we have to really keep in mind each generation's values are shaped by historical events and experiences during their lifetime. So we have to understand generational realities as a way to create acceptance and collaboration. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Katie?
There's a lot to unpack in that for sure. And, we could look at each generation differently. When we talk about baby boomers and Gen X, they really lean into that face-to-face or phone conversation for all of their communication. That's how they were raised. That's what was going on in the world when they were just starting their careers. Whereas you look at millennials and Gen Z, they're very comfortable with instant messaging, collaboration tools like Slack, and they like feedback. They don't necessarily want to be told how to do everything or micromanage, but they want to know that they have the information they need to get started and that the track they're going down is the correct track rather than having to backtrack and do things again. I always laugh to myself because I am literally on that millennial Gen Z cusp. And so I even find that I struggle with some of the tools that Gen Z are using every day because I wasn't born growing up with a device in my hands. A lot of your social media platforms only came into existence the year after I graduated college. And so even for those of us in that middle, flexing between the older generations and the younger generations is a very interesting dynamic. And I also think that as we move into this more tech-heavy pace, we also tend to assume that the younger generations don't want to read anything in print and they don't want to do anything face-to-face. And the reality is that's not true. Being in the media industry, there's a lot of studies going on that younger generations actually prefer print for certain tasks. Certainly not everything like we used to, but they're so overwhelmed and inundated with screen time that they are seeking ways to connect with others in a more real and authentic way, and have some of those tangible materials to read and enjoy off screen. We need to look at how these differing preferences, come into tension at work and remember that everybody is really an individual. And so understanding how that individual wants to receive recognition, receive guidance on the work that they're doing, how they can learn from other generations, right? One of the big thing is knowledge transfer. Baby boomers are retiring at a rapid pace. If organizations can't figure out how to get that knowledge to their next generation of worker, they're going to lose a lot of their intellect as the workforce changes over.
Yeah, for sure. That institutional knowledge is priceless, right? And I think what you're talking about is so interesting because again, talking about these sort of how conditions happening, historical conditions happening, shape us and shape the people in our workforce. I was thinking about this as I was reading that, if you were a recent college graduate and started your first job during the pandemic, I think people need to look at that, right? When I look back at, my first job out of college, which I was training horses, which was awesome. But, that's very different. It was a very different environment. And so if you started your first job during the pandemic, it was remote. And so that's what that's the context that you have for working, right? And so if that worked for you, then you're going to probably put a high value on having the ability to have a flexible work environment, a flexible work schedule, communicating digitally. It's very easy, comfortable for you. That doesn't mean it's wrong. And I think this is where it's so important for us to have this conversation of there's so much coming out now, right, of this return to office mandates that are happening. There's an impact that has on people who started their work career in a remote environment for 2 or 3 years, right? And on the other hand, you might have, a lot of people in your generation, the millennials, came out of college into the Great Recession in 2008. It's like, hey, welcome to the world. This is grown up, time to start adulting. You know, and so they've seen the result of that. They've experienced the result of that. So for them, you know, job security and maybe some certainty is probably important in some respects. And so if they're not getting that in a job, then they're going to go look for it. Doesn't mean that they are lazy or don't want to commit or whatever. You know, these are all the things that I when I hear people talking about different generations, my big thing ends up going, you know, I just want to find out, what was it like for you when you first came into the workforce? Because I think that we forget those things. I know we forget those things. Mm-hmm. And we forget what it was like when we first came into the workforce and how we were treated. I can tell you, I had lots of experiences when I was in my 20s of, you know, older generations working with me who really felt a need to lecture to me, you know, a lot of like, oh, well, you know, when you just need to learn to do this. And my favorite was when they would tell me, oh, you need to appreciate this. And I thought, you don't know me. You don't know anything about me. And I didn't appreciate that. I didn't appreciate being spoken to in a condescending way simply because I was 20 and they were 60. Mm-hmm. And right?
I say one of my favorite lines was, because we've always done it this way. That
oh,
was
dear Lord.
Explanation for everything.
Exactly. And so, you know, now, and I think some of this probably comes from my experience as a coach. And when I was teaching writing to people, I had to train myself to remember what it was like to not know what I know now. Mm-hmm. If I step in to teach someone who's never been on a horse, and I expect for them to know what to do, right? In order to do it the way I do it, as someone who had been, you know, who's been riding and training horses for a very long time, that's all I'll say. And that's unfair for me to expect that of that person that I'm teaching. And so for me to effectively help that person learn, I have to shift my brain out of all the knowledge and experience that I have, and I have to put myself in their shoes. And I have to go, what was it like for me when I didn't know how to turn my eyes and follow, you know, move my hands, all the things that we do when we're riding. So I think that that's an important piece of how multi-generational teams can start to work better together, is for everyone to start to look at things through a different lens. So I think that's a little bit of what we wanted to kind of chat about.
Yes. And, you know, as you were talking about that, Ginny, it reminded me of the article you shared with me before we recorded today. It was this Harvard Business Review article by Megan Gerhardt, who is the Director of Leadership Development at Miami University's Farmer School of Business and the author of Gintelligence. And she wrote that many of the generational conversations in the news today rely on false stereotypes and clickbait headlines. Sound familiar? Rather than taking the time to understand the important differences that are part of our generational identities. And then when we assign those negative or overreaching characteristics to each group, we imply their values, beliefs, and goals are fundamentally flawed. And when you shared that with me, you know, I'm always thinking about ways to relate my horse experience to leadership in the workplace. And when I read that, I thought, oh my gosh, you have just described my horse that we call Baby Winston. Winston is now 2, but when he was born, literally at 2, I don't even think he was home for 2 weeks, because we took him to a foaling station, aka a hospital for horses to have their babies. One of the people that were caring for him immediately took a dislike to him, and that was because he was a colt, which is a male horse. And there's this stereotype that young male horses are all fractious. They're mean, they're aggressive, they're, you know, you name it. Start thinking about how that relates to the younger generations that we talk about in the workplace as far as their stereotypes. Well, that person's dislike really translated over to how he responded to them when they were feeding him, when they were letting him in and out. It spilled into our relationship as the caretaker versus the owner, and really was the driving factor behind deciding that we actually needed to buy our own property. And that had always kind of been the long-term goal, but this was sort of the push of, we just cannot come to an understanding and being curious about how these stereotypes are impacting.
Yeah.
Well, little baby Winston went to the horse trainer last week to start learning how to be a big horse. And the first message I got from the trainer said, he's smart, he's good-minded, and he's going to be simple to train. Doesn't mean he's not going to have his temper tantrums, because I think we all get uncomfortable when we're pushed to learn and do something different. But he didn't look at this horse and say, oh, he's a 2-year-old colt, he's going to be XYZ. He gave him an opportunity. He got curious. He asked him to do things. He saw how he responded, and they moved through their training session in that manner. And so when I think about that in terms of our workplaces, when we put those stereotypes on our generations that are in the workplace with us, that can impact our team performance. How about employee engagement? We're talking about record lows of employee engagement and retaining our workforce. So if we can get curious and appreciate what each generation brings, we can have a much more thriving organization at the end of the day.
I love that so much, Katie. When I saw your note on that in our show notes that we put together ahead of time, I was like, oh, this is perfect. It is a perfect description of that, and it is true, right? Differing values and beliefs, perceptions, and assumptions create tension, and we know that negative beliefs about each other are going to cause problems for us to work together, right? Generational bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious, it undermines collaboration. It's plain and simple. If I step into the interaction with negative beliefs, perceptions, and assumptions about you simply because of your age, or you do the same about me because of my age, we're starting off already kind of like, I'm over here and you're over there, and I'm not coming together with you because I know what's best. You don't know what I know. All the things that transpire. And so, it's so important for all of us to learn how to start to let go of those things. And I love that about being curious. And these negative beliefs, perceptions, assumptions, they also create huge barriers to trust and respect. And they inhibit the open exchange of ideas for that are critical for us to be able to innovate and problem solve and all the things. How many times have we all sat in a meeting where there's, people that we feel don't respect us because of our age or whatever other things that they might have going on with us. And so we don't contribute, right? Or if we're the person who holds the bias against the other people, right? Let's say that I go into a meeting and I have a team of millennial and Gen Z folks. If I step into that meeting with a preconceived belief, perception, or assumption that I know more than you all, right? And if I step in with other negative things like, well, you feel entitled, so anything that you say, I'm going to filter through those beliefs.
I really love that you brought that up, because aside from our show notes, yesterday I was working on a project and I was speaking with a veterinarian who is also a coach and helps build culture in veterinary practices, because there's a lot of stress on our veterinarians. And one of the things that he has worked really hard on in his practice is to get the veterinarians under him, so many of them are younger, different generations, to get them comfortable feeling like they can speak up. And this is the story that he shared with me. He was working on diagnosing a dog that he thought had an allergy. And so he was going down this whole path of working on this dog as having an allergy and treating it as such. One of the younger veterinarians in the practice, because he had encouraged them to speak up, said to him, I think we need to explore some other options. And it turned out the dog ended up having internal bleeding. And the course of treatment that he was going for would not have helped the dog, and probably the dog would have passed. And because he values the intergenerational input and encourages them to speak up when it can be hard to talk to your boss and tell your boss that maybe they're not doing something correctly, they were able to change course immediately and save that dog's life.
Wow, that is amazing, and I'm always hopeful that my vet offices operate that way.
But I mean, think about it in terms of any workplace, right? I mean, if we,
Right.
as a leader, are going down this path with a specific project we're working on and we're missing a bigger picture, what is it costing us? It's not costing us a dog's life, but it very well might cost us a big contractor, a big client, or translated into the workplace you're in, and it could be very costly.
Absolutely. And so, as we were developing this conversation for today, and your story about Winston also prompted this for me to think about, well, how do horses handle having multi-generations in their herds? Because they do. And especially in the natural world, right, with wild horses, there's multiple, so many generations of horses that are living together. And your story about Winston really hit with me because, I trained young horses for quite a bit of my professional career. And I worked with them. I worked at a breeding farm. And so I was with those horses from the time they were born until they were 2 or 3 years old when they went to their new homes. And my job was to prepare them to be successful in a human world. Mm-hmm. That was how I described my work. And that was how I thought of my work. My work wasn't to make these horses be a certain way. My job wasn't to force these horses into compliance. My job was to prepare them to be able to follow a very, very wacky rule system that the human world has for them. And so, I can remember watching the mama horses, the mares, with their babies out in the fields because they would be turned out together in herds. So there would be multiple mother horses and with their babies, and they all, interacted, and sometimes there was, one mama horse might kind of be babysitting at any given point in time, so she would have multiple babies hanging around with her. But I really, I watched how they socialized and how these young horses were taught to operate within the horse structure and in the herd structure. And so, it's very clear horses have one language, doesn't matter where they are in the world. They also have the same rules no matter where they are in the world. And so that was helpful for them. But when I watched that process play out, there was always clarity, for the young horses of, yes, they were allowed to play and explore and do things that baby horses do. They have to do in order to learn about the world. They have to have context. They have to learn context. But then there were times where if things were getting a little out of hand, that the mother horses would create some boundaries and they would say, nope, we're not doing that. But, as I would start working with the horses more and more, when they got to be, usually when they're about 1 year old is when I would start doing more school with them. And for me to expect a 1-year-old horse or a 2-year-old horse who, right, is the equivalent of like a teenager to early 20s person, for me to expect them to know all the things that the 20-year-old horses knew was unfair. Mm-hmm. And so if I punished a young horse, which I didn't do, but if I had punished a young horse because they got scared of something that something they saw, and I would say, this is my favorite when people go, better than that. No, they don't. They don't, because they don't have the experience. Yes, But my 20-year-old horses that I worked with, that I had for lessons, or our brood mares, they could walk by all kinds of things. It didn't faze them. Why? Because they had done it multiple times. They had realized it wasn't going to harm them, and they had developed the ability to emotionally regulate themselves. I couldn't expect that of the 1 and 2-year-old horses. That it just would have been unfair, and I would have set them up for failure. And so it was critically important for me, when I was working with young horses, to stop and remember what they don't know yet. And so that gave me compassion and understanding, and it helped me to be curious about, okay, what can I do? Because what you're talking about with Winston, right? With the trainer, just sort of like, let's be curious and see what he's curious about. Let's just expose him to things and see how he responds. And so that mindset, right, is what sets up a young horse for success. And I have learned, having now led teams for quite a while, and having members of younger generations on my teams, that when I can stop for a moment and remember that they don't have the same context that I do, I don't have their context either. And it's just so critical for us to remember those things and be willing to look at it from that perspective, you know?
That reminds me of a workshop I led last year. It really kind of plays into that understanding of somebody else's perspective. And I think horses really are that they level the playing field for people.
For sure.
I think you would agree that most people in our workshops do not have any horse experience at all.
Right.
But I had this unique workshop last year where about half the team had horse experience of varying levels, some of them to expert, probably even more than myself, and some of them not at all. And the mix of generations on both of those was pretty evenly spread. We had pretty much every generation in the horse knowledge camp as we did the non-horse challenge camp. And what we did is we actually created an opportunity for those with the horse knowledge to mentor their team members who did not. And some of those that they were mentoring were older generations. And also the opposite. Some of them were the older generations mentoring some of the younger generation workers. And it really set up a very fascinating debrief after this one particular activity we did, because they all of a sudden could see their coworker from a different perspective, and they got an opportunity to lead in situations where they may have been a little bit lower on the hierarchy scale and didn't really lead. And so in a follow-up conversation that I had with that senior vice president after the event, who was not a horse person, he talked about how helpful it was to see different members of his team interacting with each other and sharing knowledge, getting curious about what perspective they came from, and being vulnerable in those sharing moments, which can be hard to do in your everyday workplace when you've got pressure of deadlines and the same four walls that you work in every day.
Yeah, I love that so much. And I think it just speaks to the power of this work that we do, the equine assisted leadership and team development work. And why more and more organizations are bringing it in. I was in Singapore last month working with a group of emerging leaders from a global finance company, because they know that they need to find new ways to prepare people and also to bring people together to learn about each other. And I think this is one of the things I'm so inspired by, my clients' willingness to see each other in a different light after working together in an equine assisted learning workshop. The experiences with the horses, like you said, it's a leveler. Horses don't care about your title, they don't care about your resume, and they don't care about stereotypes. They do not care at all how old you are, right? They care about how you lead, and are you making them feel safe? Are the decisions you're making for them in their best interest? That's what the horses want to know. And so, being able to have these learning experiences in an environment where there's a total lack of judgment from the horses, because they're just giving us information. It does encourage vulnerability and authenticity across the generations of the people that are there. I see it all the time. And I'm doing these workshops several times a month all over the country and also globally. And watching these processes happen, it gives me a lot of hope for our multi-generational teams. But it also really helps to reframe the assumptions that people have, because like you were saying with the mentoring exercise, I think that's so beautiful, because by giving the opportunity to some of the younger team members to step up and offer guidance to the more senior team members, that this now helps to reframe assumptions about both sides, right? And it really starts to highlight the value of that everybody can contribute. Everybody has something of value to contribute to the team and the conversation. And I'm always so appreciative of the opportunity to be in the space with clients when they move through this, right? Things start out, it's always a little rough at the beginning. But I just had this last week in a workshop where, I watched a very high performing team that was multi-generational. It was probably maybe one or two Gen Xers, and then the others were millennials. It was 8 team members. And but I guess I watched them go through this learning process together. But that was so vital, because they went through it together. They watched each other, kind of being like, I don't know what to do. I have no idea how to move this horse without touching it. And so being able to provide those kind of experiences where you can get people to let go, even if it's just for a little while, to let go of those beliefs, perceptions, and assumptions about themselves and each other. I think that is a real key to helping our multi-generational teams be successful.
Agreed. And I know that we could talk about this for hours.
Yes, we could.
But our listeners probably have some tasks that they have to get back to at work. And so I thought that we could wrap up with offering some thoughts about how they can take what we've talked about with the horses today and apply it into their own life, even if they haven't yet had an opportunity to come in and interact with the horses. So we talked about this already. We talked about being curious about the other people in our teams, asking questions from a non-judgmental standpoint to understand where they're coming from and help us see things in a different light. We also talked about noticing things, right? When our perceptions and our beliefs and assumptions are getting in the way of getting the work done. And that's on us as individuals. It's very easy to lean into our thoughts without actually taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture. And when we look at younger members of the workforce, I think we really have to be willing to ask, is this really the most challenging generation to manage? Or are we overlooking valid frustrations? I know this is something that you feel passionate about, and just share a little bit about that.
Well, I think it really does come down to having an understanding of the context that people have grown up in and are experiencing. And so, there are valid frustrations that different generations have based on the experiences for themselves and what they see around them, right? We've seen, millennials watch their Gen X parents be laid off when they were younger, from jobs where their parents had been very loyal employees for a long time, went to work, sacrificed, probably worked very long days, because that was very common for Gen X parents. And so how does that impact millennials' view of loyalty, right? And that's one of the things that we would hear a lot of complaining about, oh, millennials aren't loyal. Well, why should they be? What they've seen doesn't align for them with that value. And just all of those kind of things, we just have to really look at things from that perspective. And And also, I think it's important to look at what opportunities are we missing if we're not having understanding, right? We can build more engaging and inclusive workforces if we are willing to stop and just go, wow, what's this generational bias that I'm having right now? And going back to the be curious, notice it, and then be curious about what is it possible that the opposite is true? I think that's a question I have come to really value as a coach, and I use that for myself as well. And I think as we are continuing to try and figure out how to navigate through this, is just really understanding. There was another report I want to just note really quickly. A research team at HEC Paris, led by Professor Jan Algen and their co-authors, said 16 to 30-year-olds, just want you to listen to this, 16 to 30-year-olds remain deeply attached to work as a core value. Now, I read that and I thought, well, that goes completely against all the things that I hear people say about that age group. Oh, they don't want to work. No, I don't think it's that they don't want to work, but they want to work differently. And I think that's a challenge for some of us in the older generations, because we feel like we didn't get to have a say. And the younger generations are stepping up and saying, we don't want to work that way. And we're not going to. Mm-hmm. So yes, Katie, we probably need to come back and visit this again at some point in time.
Exactly. And I think too, just as we close up, that it's also really important to remember that everybody is an individual. And so each person on our team falls into a generational category, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to align with all of the traits that we assign each generation. And so really taking time to explore with that individual what is valuable about work for them, how can they contribute their strengths, is really what is going to make our workplaces thrive. So
I love that. I just want to say really quick, I love that idea of that conversation. I know one of the things that we talked about in this was, go to lunch. Go have coffee with one of your coworkers who is from a different generation, and have some conversation about what matters to them, because I think that's where you might find that you have more in common than you realize, right?
I think we tend to overlook that we have more in common than we realize in everything. But that could be a whole nother conversation. Correct?
It is. I know. Well, so we're going to wrap up today, and we hope that this episode on the cross-generational workplace has provided some helpful insights to people about how you can use wisdom of the horses to strengthen relationships with your peers of all generations. We love to hear from you. So what strategies do you use to build relationships with people who are older or younger than you? I mean, look at Katie and I. Here we are. We're multi-generational, and look at us getting along on this podcast. So we'd love to keep the conversation going. Please share your thoughts with us on social media, in the comments when this is posted. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please don't episode to subscribe, leave a review, share it with your network, because we really want to get this out in the world. But till next time, stay grounded, stay connected, and always lead with instinct.
This has been the Leading with Instinct podcast, focusing on intuitive leadership and fostering deep team connections through equine experiential leadership development and coaching. The Leading with Instinct podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Collaboration Partners, harnessing the collective human potential in organizations since 2009, providing equine experiential learning for lasting change. Get in touch at thecollaborationpartners.com and by katiethecoach.com, helping entrepreneurs and business leaders reset, reconnect, and reframe to live their best professional and personal lives. Visit katiethecoach.com for more information. For more information about equine experiential development and coaching and the Leading with Instinct podcast, visit www.leadingwithinstinct.com. The Leading with Instinct podcast is available at leadingwithinstinct.com, on the Leading with Instinct YouTube channel, and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Subscribe today, and thank you for listening to the Leading with Instinct podcast.